I was used to traveling every week. A new city, a new hotel, a new conference hall. It had all become a pattern. Land at the airport, grab a cab, check into a hotel, and then spend the next day in meetings and presentations. But that morning felt different. I just arrived in a city thousands of miles from home after an exhausting overnight flight. Sleep had been elusive, interrupted by the rustling of passengers shifting in their seats, the occasional overhead announcement, and the subtle but persistent hum of the aircraft. By the time we landed, I was running on nothing but fumes. I wanted to grab a decent breakfast at the airport, maybe sit down with a hot cup of black coffee and clear my head before the big meeting. But I was already late. My conference was scheduled to start in less than an hour, and I had no time to waste. I hailed a cab and asked the driver to take me to the conference center, hoping I'd find a cafe nearby where I could get some caffeine in my system. I didn't need anything fancy, just a quick coffee to keep me from passing out mid-presentation. As we approached the venue, I spotted a small coffee shop tucked between two larger buildings. It wasn't a chain I recognized, but it looked cozy enough. A simple black sign above the door read, "Riverside Coffee," in faded golden letters. Through the large glass windows, I could see a few customers sitting at wooden tables, lost in their laptops or morning newspapers. Perfect. I paid the driver, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The moment I stepped in, a pleasant aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled my senses, momentarily cutting through my exhaustion. The shop had a rustic charm, wooden floors, dim lighting, and the low hum of jazz playing in the background. Behind the counter stood a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, wearing a brown apron over a black t-shirt. Her name tag read Mara. She looked up and smiled as I approached. "Good morning. What can I get you?" I didn't need to think. Just a black coffee. Large. No sugar. No cream. She nodded and turned toward the coffee machine, her movements quick and practiced. I stepped aside, pulling out my phone to go over my notes for the meeting. There were only a handful of customers, an old man near the window reading a newspaper, a couple whispering quietly at a corner table, and a man in a business suit typing furiously on his laptop. No long lines, no chaos. I felt relieved. As I scrolled through my notes, my eyes flickered back to the counter just in time to see something strange. Mara was adding something to my coffee. A small packet of white powder. My brows furrowed. It wasn't sugar. She hadn't grabbed a sugar packet, and I was sure I'd explicitly said black coffee. No sugar. I watched as she quickly stirred the coffee, her eyes darting around as if checking if anyone was watching. A strange unease crept into my gut. I decided to wait until she handed me the cup before saying anything. Maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding. A minute later, she approached the counter with my coffee, smiling as she slid it toward me. "There you go. One black coffee." I reached for the cup but didn't take a sip. Instead, I looked at her and asked casually, "Hey, just making sure you didn't add anything to this, right?" She hesitated for just a second before shaking her head. "Nope. Just black coffee. Exactly how you wanted." Her smile felt forced. "I see," I said, glancing down at the cup. "Because I thought I saw you put something in it." Her fingers twitched. I didn't. It's just coffee." Her voice had a slight tremble. A cold, creeping sensation slithered down my spine. Something was wrong. I forced a smile. "All right. Thanks." I grabbed the cup and turned toward the door, my heart pounding. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. And then the door slammed shut. I turned sharply. Mara was standing in front of the door, blocking my way. "You can't leave," she said, her voice suddenly cold, void of the warmth from before. "What?" I frowned, gripping the cup tighter. "I have a meeting to get to. You have to drink your coffee here." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she turned her head and called out, "Jason! Andrew! Come here!" From the back room, two large men stepped out. Both were built like bouncers, tall, broad, and dangerous looking. My pulse skyrocketed. The cafe had fallen eerily silent. The old man, the couple, the businessman, gone. I hadn't even noticed when they had left. It was just me, Mara, and the two men staring at me like they were waiting for something. I took a step back. Look, I don't want any trouble. I just wanted a coffee. One of the men, John, I assumed, cracked his knuckles. Then drink it. My grip on the cup tightened. Every fiber of my being told me not to drink it. The powder, the hesitation, the lie. Something was in this coffee. My mind raced. If I stayed, I was trapped. If I drank, I didn't know what would happen. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. Loud, desperate, banging my fist against the glass door. Help! Call the police! Jason lunged toward me, but before he could grab me, I shoved the cup toward his face. Scalding hot coffee spilled onto his arm, and he roared in pain. That split second was all I needed. I bolted. I yanked the door open and sprinted outside, nearly colliding with a woman walking by. People on the street turned, startled by the commotion. Mara and the two men didn't chase me. They simply stood in the doorway, watching, smiling. I ran. Later that evening, still shaken, I took the coffee sample to a lab. The results? The coffee contained an extremely high concentration of fentanyl, a powerful anesthetic. A dose that high could have killed me. I reported everything to the police. They investigated, and that's when things got even more terrifying. There was no Riverside Coffee listed anywhere in the city's business registry. No employees named Mara, Jason, or Andrew. And when the police checked the address, the shop was empty, abandoned, for years. I don't know what I walked into that day, and I never, ever want to find out. I never thought a simple morning routine could put my life in danger, but some horrors don't announce themselves. They slip in unnoticed, hiding behind ordinary moments until it's too late. I work far from where I live, and without a car, I rely on public transport. That means waking up at 4 a.m. every day, getting ready in the dead silence of my apartment, and stepping out into a city that still feels half asleep. The only bright spot in my morning routine is the coffee shop at the corner of my street. It's one of the few places that open early, a small, independent cafe with dim lighting, the smell of fresh coffee, and a quiet atmosphere where I can sip my latte and go over my work before catching the 5:10 a.m. bus. Most mornings, I'm the only customer. The barista, a young woman named Rachel, works the shift alone. We don't talk much, just the occasional nod of recognition, but there's a quiet understanding between us. Two people awake, while the rest of the city sleeps. But that morning 4 months ago was different. It started when the door chimed, and a man, a woman, and a little girl walked inside. Something about them immediately felt off. For one, they didn't look like they were from around here. It's a small town, the kind where you at least recognize most faces, but theirs were unfamiliar. The parents were well-dressed. Too well-dressed for this place. The man's coat looked expensive, the kind you see in catalogs, and the woman had a silk scarf draped elegantly around her shoulders. But the girl was the opposite. Her dress was old, too thin for the chilly morning, and slightly dirty. She shivered as she clung to her mother's side, her tiny hands gripping the woman's coat. Then there was the way the parents acted. They kept whispering to each other, exchanging nervous glances every few seconds. Their eyes darted around the cafe as if they were afraid someone might be watching them. I tried to ignore it. I turned my attention back to my laptop, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the way they looked. It was the feeling in the air, like something was very, very wrong. I took another sip of my coffee and stole a glance at them. That's when I noticed the bruises. The little girl's arms, barely visible under the short sleeves of her dress, were covered in them. Some looked old and faded, but others were fresh, deep purple against her pale skin. I felt my stomach twist. She caught me looking and quickly lowered her head. I wanted to say something, but before I could, the mother's phone rang. The moment she saw the caller ID, her expression changed. Panic flashed across her face. She whispered something to the man, and without another word, they both rushed outside to take the call, leaving the girl alone. That was my chance. I got up and approached the girl. I tried to make my voice as gentle as possible. "Hey there, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She just sat there staring at the table, her hands trembling. I crouched beside her, lowering my voice. "Do you need help?" Her eyes welled up with tears. She still didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. The look on her face said everything. Something was terribly wrong. I turned to Rachel, who was behind the counter watching the situation unfold. She was frowning, concern in her eyes. I gestured for her to come over. "Can you keep them distracted for a minute?" I whispered. Rachel hesitated, then gave a small nod. She took a deep breath, and as soon as the couple walked back inside, she stepped forward and forced a polite smile. "Excuse me, ma'am, sir. Your order's ready." They hesitated. The man's eyes flicked toward their table, toward me. For a moment, I thought he'd seen right through our plan. But after a tense pause, he followed Rachel to the counter. That gave me just enough time. I took the girl's hand. "Come with me." She didn't resist. We slipped into the restroom, and I locked the door behind us. I pulled out my phone and quickly dialed 911, but before I could even speak, there was a loud bang against the door. Then another. The man's voice, cold and furious, growled from the other side. "Open the door!" My hands shook as I whispered into the phone. "There's a child in danger. Please hurry." Another bang. The lock rattled. I could hear the woman whispering urgently to the man outside, and then the door burst open. The man lunged at me before I could react. His hands wrapped around my throat, shoving me against the wall. My vision blurred as he squeezed, cutting off my air. I kicked, clawed at his arms, but he was strong, too strong. The woman grabbed my legs, pinning them down. The little girl screamed, then a sudden crash. The weight lifted off me and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Rachel stood in the doorway, a coffee pot shattered at her feet. She had smashed it over the man's head. "Run!" she yelled. The little girl bolted out of the restroom. Rachel grabbed my arm, pulling me up. We barely made it past the counter before the man recovered. He was bleeding from the side of his head, his face twisted in rage. He grabbed something from his coat, a knife. "Rachel, get the girl out of here!" I shouted. She hesitated, then nodded and ran toward the back exit with the child. I turned just in time to see the man charging at me. I dodged, grabbing the nearest thing I could, a metal tray from the counter, and swung it as hard as I could. It hit him across the face, knocking him off balance. But the woman was behind me. Something sharp tore across my arm. I stumbled, pain searing through my skin. They were both on me now, but then, a siren. The police. The couple froze, and in that split second, I ran. The police stormed in moments later. The man and woman tried to run, but it was too late. They were tackled, handcuffed, and dragged away. I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving. Rachel and the little girl were safe. Later at the station, an officer showed me a series of photos. One of them was of the girl. She had been reported missing 2 months ago. She wasn't their child. They had taken her, and they had planned to take another. The investigation is still ongoing. The little girl was placed in protective custody. As for the couple, the police believed they weren't working alone. There might be more out there, waiting, watching. I still go to the coffee shop every morning, but now I always check over my shoulder, because some nightmares don't end when you wake up. It started like any other shift. I had worked at Bean & Brew, a small coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore, for a little over a year. It wasn't a major chain, just a cozy little spot that had its share of regulars. The kind of place where people came to work on their laptops, have casual dates, or sit quietly with a book and a cup of coffee. The best part of the job? It was close to home. My apartment was just a few blocks away, a 10-minute walk at most. I didn't have a car, and honestly, I didn't need one. My routine was simple. Wake up, go to work, come home. The city wasn't as noisy here as it was downtown, but it still had enough people around that I never really felt unsafe. At least, not until that night. That evening, I was working the closing shift alone. Bean and Brew didn't have a big staff. On a normal day, there were only a handful of us, and at night, there was usually just one person scheduled. Tonight, that was me. By 8 p.m., the shop had mostly emptied out. The dinner rush, if you could call it that, had come and gone, leaving behind the usual late-night stragglers. A couple had been sitting by the window, but they left. Then, there was a guy on his laptop who finally packed up and went home. And then, there was him. A man sitting alone in the farthest corner. I'd noticed him earlier, but he hadn't ordered anything for a while. He wasn't reading. No phone, no laptop. He was just sitting. At first, I assumed he was waiting for someone, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that he wasn't. I tried not to stare, but something about him felt off. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was just there, silent, watching. I glanced at the clock. 8:50 p.m. I started my closing routine. First, I wiped down the counters. Then, I stacked the chairs from the empty tables and mopped the floor. Every now and then, I'd sneak a glance at the man. He didn't move. Didn't even pretend to check the time. Just sat there. Then finally, at 8:55, he stood up. He stretched his arms slightly, walked toward the door, and stepped outside. I let out a slow breath. The moment he was gone, I locked the front door. I still had a few closing tasks left, counting the till, shutting off the machines, but I didn't want anyone else coming in. By 9:10, I was finished. I turned off the last of the lights, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The street was quiet, not deserted, but still enough that I noticed how empty the sidewalks were. I turned right, heading toward my apartment like always. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, distant, but matching mine. I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I picked up my pace slightly, listening carefully. The footsteps behind me did the same. I swallowed, my heart starting to hammer. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder. It was him, the man from the coffee shop. He was keeping his distance, but his eyes were locked on me. Not checking his phone, not looking around like he was just heading home. Just watching me. I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe he lives this way. But then I thought about how long he sat in the shop, how he left right before closing, how he was standing outside when I locked up, and now he was following me. Number. This wasn't a coincidence. I picked up my pace. So did he. I had to think fast. I couldn't go straight home. If I did, he'd know where I lived. I looked around, searching for an escape. Then I saw it. A bar across the street. Corner bar. I didn't hesitate. I made a sharp left, crossing in the middle of the street without waiting for a crosswalk. No cars were coming, so I moved quickly. I didn't need to turn around to know he followed. When I stepped inside the bar, the dim light and low hum of conversation were a relief. People were sitting at the counter, a few at the booths. It wasn't crowded, but it was public. Safe. I slid into a booth near the back, my hands gripping the edge of the table. I took a deep breath, then slowly, I turned my head toward the window. He was there, standing outside, watching me, waiting. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he was hoping I'd leave soon. Maybe he was waiting for me to be alone again. That's when I noticed the exit sign in the back, a rear door. An idea clicked in my mind. I slid out of the booth, moving casually. I didn't want to draw attention. I walked toward the back, pushed through the exit, and stepped into a dark alleyway. The moment the door shut behind me, I broke into a fast walk. The alley led to another street, 1 block over from where I was supposed to be. I glanced behind me. Empty. He wasn't there. I hurried down the sidewalk, heart pounding in my chest. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder. Still nothing. I turned the final corner and saw my apartment building up ahead. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. The moment I was inside, I locked every bolt, every chain. Then I exhaled. I didn't see him again after that night. Not outside my building, not at the coffee shop. I never figured out who he was or what he wanted, but I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I hadn't gone into that bar? What if I had walked straight home? What if he had caught up to me? I don't have the answers. And maybe that's the scariest part of all.